I never thought I'd fall in love at military academy, but I guess life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. My name is Dylan, and this is the story of how my bunkmate changed his entire religious identity just so we could sit together during mandatory chapel services. I know how that sounds, trust me, I know. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning is where everything made sense, before it got complicated, before my heart got involved. I arrived at the academy in late August, when the humidity still clung to everything, and your uniform felt like a second skin you couldn't peel off. I'd chosen this path because my father had been military, and his father before him, and there was a certain expectation that came with being the third generation. I didn't mind, actually. I liked the structure, the discipline, the idea that every day had a purpose and a plan. What I didn't expect was being assigned to share a 12 by 14-foot room with someone who would completely upend everything I thought I knew about myself. His name was Miles Crawford. He had dark hair that he kept to regulation short, and these grey-green eyes that seemed to change colour depending on the light. When he walked into our room that first day, carrying a duffel bag and a footlocker, I was sitting on my already made bunk reading the Academy handbook for probably the third time. He looked at me, then at my perfectly arranged desk, then back at me, and this slow smile spread across his face. Not mocking, just amused. "Hey," he said, "I'm Miles. Looks like you've got this whole thing figured out already." I remember standing up too quickly, nearly hitting my head on the bunk above mine. "Dylan," I said, and shook his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, and there was something about the way he looked directly at me. No hesitation, no awkwardness, that made me feel both comfortable and strangely nervous at the same time. We spent that first evening unpacking in relative silence, occasionally asking practical questions about drawer space and closet organisation. He was neat but not obsessive like me, organised but relaxed about it. I noticed he had a small leather-bound book that he placed carefully on his desk. I didn't ask about it then. The academy had mandatory religious services every Sunday morning. It was one of those traditions that nobody really questioned, just part of the fabric of the place. During orientation week, we had to register our religious preference, which determined which service we'd attend. There were 3 options: Protestant chapel, Catholic mass, or Jewish services held in a smaller room in the administrative building. I'd grown up going to a Protestant church with my family, the kind where everyone knew everyone and the sermons were about being good people and helping your community. I checked the Protestant box without thinking much about it. I found out Miles had registered for Jewish services when we got our Sunday schedules. We were in our room, both looking at the papers we'd been handed, and I noticed his said something different than mine. "You're Jewish?" I asked, and immediately felt stupid for asking such an obvious question. He nodded. "Yeah, my mum's side. We're not super observant, but it's important to her that I maintain the connection, you know?" I nodded like I understood, but really I was just thinking about how I wouldn't see him Sunday mornings, which was a weird thing to feel sad about for someone I'd known less than a week. Those first few weeks of academy life were brutal. Wake up at 5:30, physical training at 6, classes all day, drill practice, study hours, lights out at 10. Miles and I fell into a rhythm quickly. We'd wake up at the same time, move around our tiny room in this synchronized dance we developed without discussing, getting dressed and ready without getting in each other's way. He was a morning person, which surprised me. He'd wake up actually smiling, while I needed at least 10 minutes and preferably coffee before I could form complete sentences. "Morning, sunshine," he'd say every single day, and every single day I'd grunt something that might have been words. But it was the evenings I started looking forward to most. After lights out was called, we'd lie in our bunks in the darkness, and we'd talk. Quiet conversations about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in Seattle, about his mom who was a professor of literature, and his dad who worked in tech, about his younger sister who wanted to be a marine biologist. I told him about my small hometown in North Carolina, about my dad's military career, about how I'd always felt like I was supposed to follow this particular path, even though sometimes I wasn't sure it was what I actually wanted. "You don't have to be sure yet," he said one night. "We're 18. We're allowed to still be figuring it out." Sunday mornings became the strangest part of my week. I'd go to Protestant chapel and sit in the 3rd row with the other guys from my company, and I'd sing the hymns and listen to the chaplain talk about duty and honour and faith, and the whole time I'd be wondering what Miles was doing. Was he wearing a yarmulke? Was the service in Hebrew? Did he feel connected to it, or was it just something he did out of obligation? I'd never been particularly religious, but I'd also never really thought about it before. Now, sitting in that chapel, I felt the absence of him beside me like a physical thing. It was October when things started to shift. We'd been bunkmates for 2 months, and somewhere along the way, Miles had become my best friend. My only real friend, if I'm being honest. The academy wasn't a place that encouraged deep personal connections. Everything was about the unit, the company, the team. But Miles and I had something different. We studied together, ate together, ran together during PT. People started referring to us as a unit. Crawford and Thompson, they'd say, as if we were one person. I started noticing things about him that I hadn't let myself notice before. The way he'd bite his lower lip when he was concentrating on a problem set. How he'd absently run his hand through his hair when he was tired, making it stick up in ways that violated uniform standards but somehow looked right on him. The way his whole face changed when he smiled, really smiled. Not the polite smile he gave to instructors, or the smirk he used when someone said something stupid. I noticed that he was always cold, always pulling on an extra layer when we were in the room, and I noticed that I'd started keeping the window closed even though I preferred it open, just so he'd be comfortable. One Thursday evening in mid-October, we were both at our desks working on an essay for our military history class. I was stuck on a paragraph and kept reading the same sentence over and over. I glanced over at Miles and found him already looking at me. For a second, neither of us looked away, and something passed between us in that moment, something I didn't have words for. Then he smiled, that real smile, and said, "You've been reading the same page for 10 minutes. Want me to look at it?" I handed him my paper and watched as he read, his eyes moving across my words, and I felt more nervous about him reading my essay than I'd ever felt about a grade. The next Sunday, I sat in chapel and had this sudden overwhelming thought that I was in the wrong place. Not wrong like I'd made a mistake, but wrong like my body was in one location, and some essential part of me was somewhere else. I tried to focus on the service, but my mind kept drifting. I kept thinking about Miles in that smaller room across campus, and I wondered if he ever thought about me during services, if he ever felt like something was missing. That night, in the darkness of our room, I asked him about it. "What's it like?" I said. "Jewish services, I mean." There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting in his bunk above me. "It's different," he said finally. "More participatory, I guess. Lots of Hebrew, which I'm honestly not great at. The rabbi here is pretty cool, though. He talks a lot about questioning and wrestling with faith, about how doubt is part of the tradition. I like that it's okay to not have all the answers. Why do you ask?" "I don't know," I said, which was a lie. I knew exactly why I was asking. I was asking because I wanted to understand every part of him, because the 2 hours we spent apart every Sunday morning had started to feel like the longest 2 hours of my week. Because I was beginning to realize that what I felt for Miles wasn't just friendship, and that realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. November brought cold weather and a shift in the academy's rhythm. We had more field exercises, more time spent outside in the elements, more pressure as we approached final exams. Miles and I studied together constantly, quizzing each other on military tactics and history dates and mathematical formulas. We'd developed this shorthand way of communicating, where I could look at him across the library and know exactly what he was thinking. One night, during a particularly brutal study session, he fell asleep at his desk, head pillowed on his arms. I sat there for a long time, just watching him sleep, noticing the way his breathing was steady and deep, the way his hand was curled loosely near his face. I wanted to reach out and touch his hair, push it back from his forehead. Instead, I gently woke him and told him to get in bed before bed check. It was the first week of December when everything changed. We were both in our room on a Saturday afternoon, one of the rare free periods we had. Miles was lying on his bunk reading, and I was organising my desk, which didn't need organising, but I needed something to do with my hands. "Hey Dylan," he said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, not turning around. "Do you ever feel like you're going through the motions? Like you're doing everything you're supposed to do, but there's this part of you that's just waiting for something real?" I turned to look at him then. He was sitting up, the book forgotten beside him, and he was looking at me with an intensity that made my heart rate pick up. "All the time," I said quietly. "Every single day." He nodded slowly. "I think that's why I like our talks," he said. "At night, after lights out. Those feel real. Everything else feels like I'm playing a part, but those conversations feel like I get to actually be myself. I sat down on my bunk, across from him, our knees almost touching in the narrow space between our beds. "You are yourself," I said. "At least that's who I see. This version of you, right now, talking to me. That's the real Miles." He smiled, but it was sad somehow. "You see me better than anyone else does," he said. "Sometimes I think you see me better than I see myself." And I realized in that moment that I loved him, not in some abstract future tense way, not as a possibility or a maybe. I loved him right then, present tense, undeniable and terrifying and absolutely certain. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk listening to Miles breathe in the darkness above me, and I tried to figure out what to do with this knowledge. The academy had policies, rules, expectations. My father had expectations. I'd spent my whole life following the path that was laid out for me, and now I was lying in the dark in love with my bunkmate, and I had no idea what to do about it. Sunday morning came, and I went to chapel like always. I sat in my usual spot, sang the usual hymns, listened to the chaplain talk about preparation and readiness. But the whole time, all I could think was that I was tired of going through the motions. I was tired of spending Sunday mornings away from the person I most wanted to be near. And I started thinking about what Miles had said about Jewish services, about questioning and wrestling and doubt being part of the tradition. Maybe that's what I needed. A place where it was okay to not have all the answers. Monday morning, I went to the chaplain's office during my free period. Chaplain Morris was a kind man in his 50s who'd been at the academy for over a decade. I told him I was interested in learning more about different faith traditions, that I was questioning some things and wanted to explore. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded and told me that spiritual journeys were personal and that the academy supported cadets in their religious exploration. If I wanted to attend Jewish services, I just needed to fill out a form requesting the change. It would take effect the following Sunday. I didn't tell Miles. I don't know why I didn't tell him. Maybe because I wanted to surprise him, or maybe because I was afraid he'd ask me why I was doing it, and I wasn't ready to answer that question honestly. I filled out the form, submitted it, and waited. That week felt longer than any week I'd ever experienced. Miles and I fell back into our normal routine, but everything felt different to me now. Every time he smiled at me, every time our hands brushed passing papers back and forth, every time he said my name, I felt it like electricity. On Thursday night, during our usual after lights out conversation, he told me about a book his mum had sent him, a collection of poetry by someone I'd never heard of. He read me one of the poems in the darkness, his voice soft and careful with the words, and I lay there thinking that I could listen to him read poetry forever and never get tired of it. Friday evening, Miles mentioned that he wouldn't see me Sunday morning, same as always, and I just said, "Okay, see you after." I watched his face to see if there was any disappointment there, any sign that the Sunday separation bothered him too, but he just nodded and went back to his book. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright. I got dressed in my service uniform and Miles did the same. We walked together across campus like we always did, our breath forming clouds in the December air. When we reached the point where we usually separated, where I'd head toward the main chapel and he'd continue on to the administrative building, I kept walking beside him. He glanced over at me, confused. "Chapel's that way," he said, pointing back the way we'd come. "I know," I said. "I'm not going to chapel. I'm coming with you." He stopped walking. "What?" "I requested a transfer," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "To Jewish services. It got approved. I'm coming with you." "But you're not Jewish," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite read. "You can't just switch religions so we can sit together on Sunday mornings. That's not how it works." "I'm not switching religions," I said. "I'm exploring, questioning. Isn't that allowed? Isn't that part of it?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I couldn't tell if he was angry or confused or something else entirely. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do this?" "Because I was tired of sitting in that chapel thinking about you," I said. "Because Sunday mornings without you felt wrong. Because I wanted to understand this part of your life. Because I wanted to be where you are." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of dawning realization. "Dylan," he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. Miles looked around, checking that we were alone on the path. "We need to be careful," he said, and his voice was different now, softer. "You know that, right? What this could mean if people figured it out." "I know," I said. "I've thought about it. I've thought about nothing else all week. But I'm tired of being careful about the wrong things. I'm tired of pretending that Sunday mornings apart don't bother me. I'm tired of not being honest about what I feel." "What do you feel?" he asked, and I could see that he was holding his breath, waiting. "I feel like I'm in the wrong place whenever I'm not with you," I said. "I feel like the only time I'm actually myself is when we're talking in the dark. I feel like I've been following someone else's path my whole life, and then I met you, and suddenly I can see a different way forward. I feel like I'm falling for you, Miles. Actually, I think I've already fallen." We stood there on that cold December path, close enough that I could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes had gone very bright. "I've been in love with you since October," he said. "Maybe before that. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if I should tell you. I know what this place is like. I know the risks. But Dylan, you changing your Sunday services just to sit with me, that's possibly the most romantic and ridiculous thing anyone's ever done for me." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "It is pretty ridiculous," I admitted. "I haven't even been to a Jewish service before. I don't know any of the prayers or when to stand or sit or anything. You'll figure it out," he said, and he was smiling now, that real smile that transformed his whole face. "I'll help you. We should probably get going, though. We're going to be late." We walked the rest of the way to the administrative building together, and when we entered the small room where services were held, the rabbi looked up and smiled. "Welcome," he said to me. "I'm Rabbi Silverman. Miles tells me you're interested in exploring Judaism." "Actually, I didn't tell him anything," Miles said, glancing at me. This was a surprise to me too. The rabbi looked between us and something knowing passed across his face, but all he said was, "Well, you're welcome here. Grab a prayer book. Dylan and Miles can share if that's easier for the first time." We sat together in the back row, sharing a prayer book, our shoulders touching. The service was different from what I was used to, more singing, more Hebrew, more participation from everyone there. Miles would lean over occasionally and whisper translations or explanations, his breath warm against my ear. I tried to focus on the prayers, on the rabbi's words, but mostly I was just overwhelmingly aware of Miles beside me, of the fact that I'd done this insane thing, and he'd told me he loved me, and somehow we were here together. After the service, we walked back across campus. We didn't talk much, both of us aware that we were in public, that we had to be careful. But when we got back to our room and closed the door, Miles turned to me. "That was crazy," he said. "What you did? Completely crazy." "I know," I said. "But I'm not sorry." He stepped closer. "I'm not sorry either," he said. And then he kissed me. It was soft and careful and perfect, and when we broke apart, he was smiling. "We're going to have to be so careful," he said. "This place, the rules, your family expectations." "I know," I said again. "But Miles, I'm tired of being careful about the wrong things. I want to be careful about this, about us, about protecting what we have. But I don't want to pretend anymore that you're just my bunkmate or just my friend." We spent the rest of that Sunday in our room talking about everything, about what this meant, about how we'd navigate it, about the risks and the reality of being two male cadets in a relationship at a military academy. We agreed to be discreet, to be smart, to protect ourselves and each other, but we also agreed that we weren't going to pretend anymore, at least not when we were alone together. The next few months were the happiest and most terrifying of my life. Publicly, nothing changed. Miles and I were still bunkmates, still best friends, still Crawford and Thompson, the inseparable duo. But privately, in our room with the door closed, we were something more. We'd study together at our desks, and sometimes Miles would reach over and take my hand. We'd lie in our bunks after lights out, and he'd reach down and I'd reach up, and our fingers would intertwine in the darkness while we talked. Sometimes, when we were sure everyone else was asleep, one of us would climb into the other's bunk and we'd hold each other, just for a little while, before separating again before morning. I kept going to Jewish services every Sunday. I actually started to appreciate them, to understand what Miles meant about the questioning and the wrestling with faith. Rabbi Silverman never asked directly, but I think he understood more than we said. He'd smile at us in this knowing, kind way, and he'd talk in his sermons about finding your own path, about the importance of honest questioning, about how the tradition valued both learning and love. We had close calls. Once, Our company commander came to our room for an inspection, and Miles was sitting on my bunk instead of his own, and we both froze before Miles casually said he was just looking at something on my desk from a better angle. Another time, a guy in our company asked why we spent so much time together, if we were really just friends. Miles handled it perfectly, laughing and saying that being stuck in a 12 by 14 room with someone meant you either became best friends or enemies, and he was glad we'd gone the friendship route. In February, Miles got a letter from his mum. She was asking about his life at the academy, about whether he'd made friends, about whether he was happy. He sat on his bunk reading it, and I watched his face change, saw something like sadness cross his features. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "It's just, my mum keeps asking if there's anyone special in my life, and I want to tell her about you, Dylan. I want to tell her that I've met someone incredible, that I'm happy, that I'm in love, but I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that just makes me sad." I moved to sit beside him on his bunk. "You could tell her," I said. "Not about us exactly, but about me. About your bunkmate who became your best friend. That's true, and that's something you can share." He leaned against me, and I wrapped my arm around him. "You're right," he said. "I'll write to her about my friend Dylan who switched to Jewish services just to spend more time with me. She'll probably think that's the sweetest thing she's ever heard." "It is pretty sweet," I said, and he laughed. Spring brought longer days and the stress of final exams and preparations for summer assignments. Miles and I studied constantly, pushing each other, supporting each other. One night in late April, exhausted from studying, we were lying in my bunk together, a risk we rarely took but needed that night. Miles was pressed against my side, his head on my chest, and I was running my fingers through his hair. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked. "Like after the academy?" "All the time," I said. "What do you think about?" "I think about us," he said quietly. "I think about whether there's a way to make this work long term, whether we'll get assignments in the same place, whether we'll be able to be open about who we are to each other, whether your family will ever accept this." I tightened my arm around him. "I don't have all the answers," I said, "but I know that what I feel for you isn't going to change. I know that you've become the most important person in my life. I know that I want to figure out the future together, whatever that looks like." He tilted his head up to look at me. "Even if it's hard, even if it's complicated?" "Especially then," I said, and kissed him softly. "We'll figure it out. We've already figured out so much." The end of our first year at the academy came faster than I expected. Suddenly it was May, and we were taking final exams and packing up our room for summer break. We'd both be going home to our families for 2 months before returning in August. 2 months apart felt impossible to imagine. The night before we left, we stayed up long past lights out, talking in whispers, memorizing each other. Miles gave me his leather-bound book, the one I'd noticed that first day. "It's a journal," he said. "I've been writing in it all year. I want you to have it, to read it over the summer, so you can see everything I was thinking, everything I was feeling, so you know this was real." I held the journal carefully, understanding the weight of what he was giving me. "I'll take care of it," I promised. "And Miles, this is real, the most real thing in my life." He kissed me then, long and slow and full of everything we felt but couldn't always say. When we finally broke apart, he smiled. "See you in August, Dylan. Same room, same bunks, same us." "Same us," I agreed. "Always us." I went home to North Carolina and spent the summer reading Miles's journal, learning about his thoughts and feelings from the past year, seeing our story through his eyes. I wrote him letters, careful letters that could pass as correspondence between friends, but that he would understand the deeper meaning of. He wrote back, equally careful, equally meaningful, and I counted down the days until August, until I could return to the academy, to our small room, to him. When I finally saw him again on move-in day, standing in front of our building with his duffel bag and footlocker, my heart felt like it might burst. He saw me and smiled, that real smile, and I knew that everything I'd felt all summer was right there on his face too. "Welcome back, roommate," he said when I reached him. "Welcome back," I said. And then, quietly, so only he could hear, "I missed you every single day." His smile got bigger. "I missed you too. Come on, let's get settled. We've got a whole new year ahead of us." As we walked into the building together, I thought about that first day, almost a year ago, when I'd been sitting on my bunk reading the handbook, and he'd walked in and smiled at me. I thought about the path I'd been on before I met him, the one laid out by expectations and tradition and other people's plans. And I thought about the path I was on now, the one I'd chosen, the one that led to him. It wasn't the easier path. It wasn't the one anyone expected, but it was mine, and it was real, and it was filled with love, and that, I thought, was worth everything.